Good evening. It is Tuesday, the final day of March, let's get this month behind us and get on to something else. And I'm sure this April will probably be another long month, a difficult month for many people. But we're going to hang in there and get to the warmer weather and get COVID 19 all handled. So, I'm going to keep on reading from Knowing Jesus. The intelligence of the victim comes from a freedom in giving oneself to others, in not being moved by the violence of others, even when it perceives that this free self-giving is going to be lynched as a result. The free self-giving is not a seeking to be lynched, but is completely open-eyed about the probability of justice happening. However, not even the natural fear of this is enough to shake the freedom that is based on a continual loosing, forgiving, of the violence of the other's relationship to the free self-giver. Now, the evidence is that Jesus taught before and on his way up to his execution exactly this sort of open-eyed freedom towards being lynched. And indeed, that this is the whole drift of his moral teaching. He taught people how to loosen themselves from relationships of violence with each other, where their personalities were constituted by the reciprocal give and take of that violence, and instead to start to side with the victims and those who can easily be victimized. Even though, as an inevitable consequence of this breaking out of the violent determinism of the world, they would be liable to become victims themselves. Let me recap. The intelligence of the victim is a discovery of the sort of human beings we are, and how we tend to build our personal and social identities on a series of exclusions. The discovery was and is made possible because Jesus had the intelligence of the victim from the beginning. After the resurrection, the disciples began to see the internal coherence between his teaching and the way he lived, leading up to his death. That is to say, the intelligence of the victim that had been in Jesus passed on to them. They began to be able to understand the story of Jesus' life from Jesus' own point of view. Now this, the intelligence of the victim in the disciples, was not, I think, an immediate flash, but a process of understanding, to which the gospel texts give witness. You may be worried by what appears to be an excessive concentration on the theme of the victim, as though I am making out that to be a victim is in itself a good thing. Nothing could be further from my meaning. Please remember that I'm not trying to give a simple abstract account of some topics to our faith, but rather to explore the process by which the disciples came to understand Jesus as a result of the resurrection. This approach is designed so that we can have some pegs on which to hang any approach to the question of how we know Jesus, which is what this book is pointing towards. So let me illustrate further what I mean by the intelligence of the victim which came to the disciples. The Gospels witness to the way in which Jesus knew that the authorities, variously described as chief priests, elders, scribes, or Pharisees, were at various times plotting against him, to get rid of him. He is shown as revealing to them exactly what they were doing in a series of teachings, such as the parable of the murderous tenants of the vineyard. But Jesus was not only revealing to them their behavior with regard to his person, he was also establishing the criterion for understanding the kingdom of God. In running their vineyard on the basis of the exclusion of others, prophets, and the Son of God, they miss the whole point of the vineyard, which would be taken over by people who would build from the excluded victim, not by excluding the victim. For that is how God makes God's self known among humans. This is the density in Jesus' quotation to the Pharisees of the line from Psalm 118. The very stone which the builders rejected has become the head of the corner. This was the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes. Again, just to show that what Jesus is revealing is not merely the hidden motives behind the conflict between himself and the Pharisees, but something beyond that, look at the woes to the scribes and Pharisees in Matthew 23. This is a passage about missing the point. It gradually builds up from an attack on what might be taken as isolated examples of the distorted religious observance of a particular caste, to linking that sort of religion to a blindness about involvement in building a society on murder. I quoted already the verse about the blood of the innocent Abel, showing that the criticism was universal. The pain behind the denunciation is precisely that the heirs of Moses ought to have known and understood the terrible way in which human societies work by basing their social order on victims. If they had been faithful to Moses, they would have understood and been the builders and constructors of a society which did not do that. Their society, based on the victim people expelled from Egypt, should precisely not have been like those other nations. Jesus' painful denunciation was exactly because Israel was behaving like the nations, and therefore its strict observance of the law, far from doing what the law was meant to do, create a society in which there were no victims or victimizable people, where orphans and widows and exiles and sojourners were honored. Well, this was simply a piece of whitewashing covering over the same violence as happened everywhere else. To see this denunciation as simply as an attack on the Pharisees is to miss the point. It is a revelation that the Pharisees are betraying their sacred task of constructing God's kingdom and have become the same as all the other religions, clothed in veils of self-delusion about their involvement in violence. It is a denunciation made out of pain ending in the great cry, "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who kill the prophets and stone those who are sent to you. How often would I have gathered your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you would not. Behold, your house is forsaken and desolate." So the intelligence of the victim is not only the criterion for a moral life of the Christian, moving into freedom and thus running the risk of becoming a victim, but it is also the criterion from which Jesus judges and criticizes the religious practices of humanity. That is the human construction of social order. However, it is not only that, and here I tread on a very difficult ground. It sounds as though the intelligence of the victim might be simply a negative thing, a strategy for coping with a wicked world. It is in fact more than that. I indicated that Jesus' moral teaching was about freedom, that is, the demand that we work out from a series of reactive, reciprocating relationships to be able to act freely. It is this which makes it possible to side with human victims, that makes its practicer, him or herself, a likely candidate for victimage. The intelligence of the victim is a consequence of something which precedes it. That is the teaching about freedom. It is fascinating to observe how in the Gospels the disciples were able to discern this back in the life of Jesus from their new perspective of people touched by the resurrection. It was not, as they could see, having been killed that made Jesus special, or even having been killed and raised again. It was what, for want of a better term, I call the free self-giving of Jesus, which led to his being crucified. That is to say, the life of human freedom leading to persecution, which Jesus was teaching his disciples, was first led by him. And it was this free self-giving that made him special. I would even go so far as to say that this was the sign that they had among them a man who was also God. As the disciples' intelligence of the victim deepened, so they saw the self-giving as prior to the passion. So Luke and Matthew take us back beyond Jesus' public ministry to the infancy and illustrate the givenness of Jesus as an infant. Luke characteristically emphasizes the graciousness of the given in Jesus, the angels, the child in the temple, but keeps alive the threat of the sword in Simeon's prophecy to Mary. Matthew characteristically portrays Jesus' infancy as a series of near escapes from lynch deaths. Mary was not stoned thanks to an angel telling Joseph to take her as wife even though she was pregnant. Herod did not manage to massacre Jesus, who had escaped to Egypt. Yet Jesus was clearly given as a fulfillment of the prophecy concerning Emmanuel. Notice how the intelligence of the victim reaches right back into the family life of Jesus. Our song this day will be, if you have a hymnal at home, Song 322, O Love, How Deep. Our Good night.